So this is the Chapter 41 review video. The first topic in the chapter is 9/11 and Al-Qaeda. So on 9/11, 2001, September 11th, 4 planes were hijacked by Al-Qaeda terrorists, and 2 of those planes famously hit the Twin Towers, as you can see in this picture. It was completely devastating, resulting in 2,606 deaths. And one of the planes hit the center of the Pentagon, causing 189 deaths. And one plane crashed in rural Pennsylvania, resulting in just the passengers' jet deaths after the passengers heroically retook the plane and crashed it into the field. And that resulted in a total of 2,996 deaths. So Al Qaeda, the group responsible for this, was a growing right-wing extremist group in Afghanistan. They had been fighting with other extremist groups for power, and their leader was Osama bin Laden in this picture right here. And the Taliban was formed by Al Qaeda as sort of a task force for them, and they eventually ended up taking over Afghanistan, and recently when the U.S. pulled troops out of Afghanistan. And then, as a direct result of 9/11, came the acts against terrorism by the federal government. The first of these acts being the U.S. Patriot Act, which allocated more power to federal government for surveillance and detention. And what that pretty much means is the government now had access to people's emails, people's calls, people's texts, all stuff like that. All of this was to try and find suspected terrorists. And they also had permission to detain anybody they suspected of terrorism, which this led to the Department of Homeland Security, which is more dedicated to protecting the borders instead of the U.S. Patriot Act just protecting, or I guess surveilling, U.S. citizens. And the Department of Homeland Security ended up detaining many suspicious immigrants and many convicted terrorists or convicted Taliban members. And a lot of these Taliban members ended up in the Guantanamo detention camp in Cuba. And you can see this camp right here. And then George W. Bush against Iraq. So in year 2000, George W. Bush was elected for president. And he quickly launched an offensive against Iraq, which their dictator, Saddam Hussein, had been constantly evading UN's weapons inspections, which were mandatory. And for this reason, Bush declared military action against Iraq. And Hussein supposedly had been hiding WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction, within his country, and this led to lots of fear among the American people. Eventually, this led to the complete invasion of Iraq, which began March 19th, 2003. And in less than a month, Baghdad has fallen, and Hussein had been driven from power, so that was very effective on Bush's part. But on the other part, the U.S. had ended up committing many atrocities and many war crimes. One of these was the Abu Ghraib prison, which where Iraqi prisoners were tortured and humiliated, which it could only made tensions worse against Iraqi citizens in the U.S. Iraqi citizens already despised the U.S., but after hearing of the atrocities done in this prison, they hated them even more. This is the only picture I could find that was appropriate for this slideshow. But if you want to look at other pictures on your own, I'd just be careful. And in 2004, the U.S. ceded political power and gave rise to an Iraqi parliament and president, which did not last long. And then George W. Bush for re-election in 2004. One of his first acts was the No Child Left Behind Act. This is one of his few good policies that he made. And it pretty much shut down any schools that weren't able to perform effectively. So, like, if they couldn't get certain test marks or anything, they would completely renovate the school. And he also proposed constitutional amendments banning gay marriage. And Bush also primarily argued his credibility through the handling of terrorism through Iraq. And his running mate, John Kerry, was the Democratic selection for the election. And he was much more progressive than Bush. And he gained credibility from his wartime experience in Vietnam, but he still lost the election. And the popular vote was 60,000, or 60 million to 57 million. And the Electoral College was also pretty close. It's 286 to 252. In some of Bush's new policies, he proposed privatizing Social Security, which was refuted by the American Association of Retired Persons. Like his policy was shut down after about 6 months, and Bush failed to establish a strong Iraqi government. And it quickly fell back into a power vacuum with many dictators trying to fight for power. And then Hurricane Katrina hit and caused 1,300 deaths and $150 billion in damages. And this also led to Bush's decline and less popular support for Bush because the federal government was unequipped to handle such a crisis, and they didn't really help the people. And specifically the Federal Emergency Management Agency was completely ineffective.
The Great Recession of 2008 was caused by mortgages. Too many mortgages were handed out to individuals that had poor credit ratings. Furthermore, many Wall Street banks participated in many risky lending practices that further exacerbated the mortgage crisis. It is hard to pinpoint an exact date for when the recession began, but many modern-day financial analytics refer to when Lehman Brothers, a large investment bank, declared for bankruptcy, which sent shockwaves throughout Wall Street and throughout other financial hubs and sectors in the United States and globally. Many individuals lost their homes and jobs, but in particular, many real estate development companies and real estate selling agencies went bankrupt due to the Great Recession and the fact that many houses were being foreclosed on and that the housing market as a whole had collapsed. As you can see here, this in the picture in the bottom right, these are some of the many houses that went on foreclosure, as very nice houses were lended to people that couldn't afford them or had too low of a credit rating, which resulted in the bubble bursting of the housing market. Next, we see a new administration come in 2009, and Barack Obama is the first African American president ever. He inherits the aftermath effects of the Great Recession. He's inaugurated in 2009, and then he puts together multiple recovery packages swiftly with the help of Congress. The two major ones you need to know for this chapter are the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act and TARP, which is the Troubled Asset Relief Program. These two acts combined bailed out many Wall Street firms such as Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, JP Morgan, and many more. According to the textbook, it emphasized increasing government spending in order to offset decreased private spending in times of economic trouble. Also, automotive companies as well were bailed out under TARP and ARR, such as Chrysler and General Motors. Many individuals on both sides of the political spectrum were enraged by these corporate bailouts of the banks and some of the auto manufacturers. Also, with the help of Congress, Obama passed the Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which created Wall Street regulation in the form of the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, which added to the beefiness of the already SEC and other long-lasting governmental agencies that were established in the New Deal era. However, ultimately, no Wall Street executives faced any jail time for causing the Great Recession. Zero. Nada. Many socio-political movements rose to prominence because of the Great Recession. One of the more well-known ones was the Tea Party. The Tea Party was a grassroots Republican faction that rose to prominence after the American Recovery Reinvestment Bill. It was criticized by Democrats and other members of the GOP that supported the American Reinvestment Act for giving the bailouts to the corporations. Members included figures such as Sarah Palin and Texas's own Ted Cruz. They were in direct opposition to all of Obama's fiscal policies and proved to be a thorn in his side throughout his first term as president. They also had massive voting sway in the midterm election of 2010. However, nowadays, the Tea Party has the Republican faction of the Tea Party has dissolved and has been turned more into a modern day MAGA movement in which many modern day Republicans side with Donald Trump, whereas there are certain factions in the Republican Party that don't go for Trump, such as the ousted Liz Cheney and Ian Kinzinger. The Occupy Wall Street movement was also a movement in the late 2010s to early 2011, which many young voters and young people protested outside of Wall Street corporations and set up tents in the corporate district of New York City to protest corporate power, and this began really around the mid-time of the 2010 midterms. This inspired similar movements in other metropolitan areas as well, and if you synthesize this, it relates to the Black Lives Matter movement, protests that young people pushed in 2020.